Hello, welcome to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. At the Foundation, we are a community of scholars and practitioners who promote dialogue, support research and create resources in order to equip churches and those who work in them, and to facilitate the building of flourishing community through transformative change. You can find us at our website, susannawesleyfoundation.org. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hello and welcome to a conversation about disability and neurodiversity in the church, pre-lockdown, during lockdown, and in this strange season when we don't quite know what comes next. I'm Sue Miller, Director of the Susanna Wesley Foundation, and I'm here with Fiona MacMillan and Rachel Noel. And when I say here, I mean on Zoom. This is an online chat with all the vagaries that brings. I'm going to start by asking Fiona and Rachel to say a few words about themselves.
I'm Fiona MacMillan. I am a trustee of Inclusive Church and I chair the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields. For the last 9 years, we've been working together to host an annual conference on disability, sometimes neurodiversity, and the church, uniquely for rather than about disabled people. So disabled people are often isolated by experience or geography, and this is a once-a-year chance to get together and share our experience and ideas to resource each other and the church. And that's where I met Rachel.
Indeed. So I'm Rachel Noel. I'm vicar in Pennington in the New Forest, an Anglican church. And I've grown up with severe asthma and allergies, but also more recently in curacy was diagnosed with various neurodiverse labels, and was really excited and encouraged to be invited to be a storyteller at last year's disability conference at St Martin in the Fields, telling the story of my experience of neurodiversity. And I've been going to church since I was tiny. In fact, I first knew Sue at church, the church where I grew up. But I've always, even though I'm now a vicar, have always kind of felt that I didn't quite fit, didn't quite belong, struggled to, how do other people seem to get it? And I just missing something, find it hard to pay attention, hard to concentrate. And for me, the Neurodiversity Conference was, I think, my first experience of feeling so safe in church that I didn't have to worry about or make a choice between looking like I was praying or what I look like when I'm praying. Because for me, those are quite different. What I look like when I'm praying is often fiddling, crochet, drawing, doodling. Whereas the image of what you're kind of meant to look like in church when you're praying, you've all got a picture of what that looks like. Somebody with ADHD, which is one of my labels, doesn't really fit. And for me, that Neurodiversity Conference was an absolute treat to actually connect with others across the church from all sorts of different churches and experiences with their own different lived experience of similar conditions, different conditions, and just, it's just a slice of heaven. Fiona, thank you.
One of the things that often happens is we are isolated by these labels and by these experiences. And so in a church, you might be the only wheelchair user, or the only person who hears voices, or the only person with epilepsy, or the only autistic person. And so you're used to those things which make you different from those around you, this sense of there being a norm and of you being different from. And often different from becomes this kind of internalized idea of less than, of deviant, of deficit in some way, rather than this thing which we as Christians believe, which is that we're all made in the image of God. We're all perfectly and wonderfully made. Yet somehow in churches, there's this idea that we're perfectly and wonderfully made, and in church there is this norm. There is this way of behaving, this way of being, this way of moving, this way of thinking, this way of worshipping, this way of understanding, this way of processing sensory information, this way of being, standing, all those things of moving around. And that is how God is to be worshipped in this place. And we call that tradition. But somehow I think those traditional things are less helpful. And for me, the more we understand about difference and diversity and about human beings and embodied weakness, then the more we should be open, being broken open to those different experiences of worshipping, of being, as we are, rather than as we feel we ought to be. I think disabled and neurodivergent people bring a particular gift to the church of living vulnerably. When we live vulnerably, then we are more able to be open about our dependence on each other and our dependence on God. And actually, very often in churches, we talk about weakness, but we practice strength. And there is something so powerful about the living ministry and the living witness of disabled people, which we can give to the church.
And I think something of what you're saying there is, I think, goes alongside with often how pastoral care is enacted in churches. I mean, certainly my own experience in the past when I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome is actually pastoral care, and our networks in churches are generally set up for kind of crisis of somebody just drops out of how they can normally be part of church for a few weeks and they're ill, and we go and help them, and we maybe set up giving them dinners or something. And it's very much, are we doing stuff for that person in need until they can be back with us in the way that fits. And I think for me, quite often people who have different ways of living, of how life is, actually being the recipient of pastoral care, and this is very stereotype, but it often comes with a head on one side and a slightly sickly, sweet, lovely voice. And I know that it's really well intentioned and comes from a place of care, but actually being the other side of it, it's really hard to remain as an adult and to keep your self-esteem and kind of grown-upness within that engagement, because you become the poor, needy person that's we want to look after. My own personal experience of that years ago, when I was least able to be in church regularly, I ended up getting really involved in online gaming with World of Warcraft, because in that environment I could still be Rachel and still be a functioning adult person with things to offer and ways to contribute, in a way that at the church I had just become numbered, I don't know, whatever, on the prayer list of people we prayed for and hoped might be back with us soon, and the sort of recipient of the sort of home communion. And that sounds really awful, like I don't value what they did, and I get it was people trying really hard, but I have to say, I think for people where their way of living and experiencing is different from the norm, the way that we often do pastoral care at church is designed to help people fit back into how we do things, rather than necessarily valuing how they might live and flourish as who they are, that might not be present in church in the building at 9:30 on a Sunday morning, or whatever that might be.
Feeds into the whole healing narrative, the way that the church has got so bogged down in the kind of healing cure things. I think there is a sense in church of conflating healing and cure, and the idea that if you go into church as an ill person with any sort of visible anything, if you go into church and you are not cured within a healing service, then somehow you haven't prayed enough. Somehow there's something wrong with you. For me, healing is about a restoration of our right relationship with God. It's about a letting go of all those things which are barriers between us and God, all those things where we are further away from God. And those, for me, are to do with the sense of sinfulness and the sense of moving away and closing down.
I've always thought that the healing miracles, I mean, Jesus always put first, didn't he, restoring right relationship, that any healing of some physical illness was always a secondary thing, wasn't it?
And he asked people, he didn't just go in and force healing on people.
No.
For me, I mean, now growing up, I was on the prayer list every week as a child and teenager because of how unwell I was. And it was only I remember spending a silent retreat with a nun, and she challenged me around the language of wellness, and it had never even occurred to me that I could be well. But because the language of healing and illness had been so deep, particularly from within church, I just absorbed it. And it was life-changing for me in kind of late 20s to realise actually I could be well with who I am and how I am. And that actually for me learning, and it's kind of, this is an ongoing lifelong thing, and I suspect it is for all of us, but when you've grown up categorised as unwell or ill or whatever it might be, or disabled, there's so many disorder languages put around stuff that for me realising that actually I could be well as I am, and to learn what it might mean to flourish with the body, the mind, the brain, the way of being that I have been born with and blessed with, has been really life-changing. And bizarrely for me, the deepest experience of that came then within some really challenging mental health situation. And actually within that was the courage to just let go of who I was trying to be, having spent so much of my life trying to fit how the world was. It's like, I kind of don't think anyone does, but actually there were different, particularly the neurodiversity that I came to understand about myself. It's like, actually I've been trying to pretend to be somebody else, and actually I need to let go of that and let myself understand through prayer, through contemplation, through time with God, to accept the wellness, the physicality that I have, the mentality that I have, and see what flourishing, and learn to understand what flourishing is with that, and the freedom within that. But actually then the challenge with others in churches in that who are scared of that, because actually we've grown up in the West where we're used to medical categories. Lots of my labels have something or other disorder on it. We kind of, in churches, I think bizarrely, have accepted some of that language more strongly than some of our scriptural language about each of us being created in the image of God, and how Jesus spent time with so many different people, not just the able-bodied well ones, and he didn't turn everybody into, superheroes. Actually, he accepted people as they were and encouraged and helped them to flourish. And my sense is that there's something that we're not always very good at in churches, at actually enabling a diversity of people to flourish. We've kind of got a sort of set idea of what flourishing looks like in a church.
So at the same time, we're able to sing hymns like Just As I Am and believe just as I am, yet we don't practice just as I am. I liked what you said previously about the idea that we have to be restored in a particular way, and that whole thing around chronic illness. I think we don't have a model for chronic illness, either in society actually or in church. We have some models for disabled people, which say, a disabled person who uses a wheelchair therefore must have a spinal injury, and that's the kind of the one size fits all.
And therefore we need a ramp and that will sort it out.
Exactly. Provide a ramp and then that's it. No, there's nothing to do. You see, I have a big thing around what is accessibility and what is access. And often people see access being a very physical thing to do with being able to get in and out of the building. And in many churches, access is about ramps, lifts and loos, or lift, loos and loops. And those things are about the physical access to get into the building, but they're not about participation. And participation is the other half of access, because you need to both get in and to join in. And that's what creates community, is when you can all get in and you can join in. And that means moving away from the idea there's one size that fits all. So if you can't stand at the lectern in order to do a reading, then you can't do a reading. But actually, what's wrong with being able to jiggle around? Or what's wrong with being able to use a handheld microphone? Or what's wrong with being able to record it in advance? There are all these ideas around people have to fit the shape of the building, and people have to fit the way things have always been done, rather than we each bring something of the image of God within us, and there are lots of different ways of doing things. And so in a sense, I wonder whether disabled people and neurodivergent people are called to be divinely disruptive. We're called to bring in the kind of the bodies and the brains that we have and be who we are, not in a way which in somehow sense shuts down other people, but actually in a way which we can sit alongside and glory in our diversity. So the table where there's space for all, but those spaces won't all be the same size, because we don't all come in kind of separated dimensions.
Well, and I wonder for me that's where lockdown comes in, because actually at the start of lockdown, my sense is that many church leaders in all sorts of different capacities who are primarily able-bodied and haven't necessarily had lived experience of difference in that same way, at the start of lockdown, many of them were completely thrown, because it's like, well, but we know how church works and it doesn't work in how this is. Whereas my sense is the experience that I had with others like myself that have had more lived experience of things not quite fitting, that actually the start of lockdown was like, well, actually, I'm used to having to kind of work with stuff not fitting. What can I do? How does this work? How could we do it? And for me, actually taking physical church into online church, for me, suddenly it was a liberation of like, actually, how many barriers have we absorbed from just the physical nature of buildings into who we include then in the ability and capacity, or who you even think of to invite to be involved in leading worship or taking part in different ways. And I think the first few weeks of lockdown, it's like almost each week it was like, oh, wait a minute, that's another barrier that I've just absorbed because I'm so used to physical church. And so I think one of my favourite services for me was the Easter Vigil I led here on the Saturday in Easter. And I decided I was going to go through the women in the Old Testament readings as the first part of the vigil service. And then suddenly it's like, I could invite my special women to take part in leading some of them. And one of those was Fiona and various other different friends and family. And then afterwards, having recorded the service and we'd shared the service, it was suddenly realising actually several of the different women involved, there were various different reasons why actually in the world before lockdown, they either hadn't been able for some time to participate in church, or there were things that made it more difficult to. And suddenly, actually, lockdown has removed quite a lot of those barriers. And I mean, with others that have been involved in my church here in different ways, it's suddenly actually those where for whom mental health can be challenging. Actually, in the world of lockdown, you could pre-record in your own time and space at home. So you could say, yes, I'd like to have a go at doing a reading in 2 weeks' time. And at some point between now and 2 weeks' time, I will record it at a time that works for me. Whereas if you commit to doing something in a building, previously we've expected that you would be absolutely sure that you would be there on that Sunday in 3 weeks' time at 9:30. And 20 minutes into the service, you would definitely be okay to come to the front of the church and stand up and read the reading with all the words coming out in the right order. Well, for some people, that's much harder asked, but actually in the comfort of their own home or garden, suddenly it becomes possible. And for me, it was realizing how many others have we excluded from even taking part? Yeah, Fiona.
Yeah. So for me, there were some really positives there around physical capacity. So I've lived with energy limiting condition for the last 23 years. I live with pain and fatigue and cognition. I use a wheelchair to get around. And generally my norm is to be able to leave the house 2 or perhaps 3 times a week. And I often will use 2 of those times to go to church. But what I can't do is go out 2 days running. There's always a cost to going out 2 days running. And so for more than 20 years, I've had to choose, do I go to church on Monday, Thursday, or do I go to church on Good Friday? Because I can't do both. And so of this holiest weekend of the year, I've always had to have 2 out of 3. And there's a rest day between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, so that I can just about do that. So this year, for the first time in a long time, I was able to go to church, be part of a worshipping community for both the Last Supper celebration on Monday, Thursday, and for the 3 hours on Good Friday. Interestingly, one of the downsides, which I think has been a fair amount of learning for all of us around church and worshipping and attendance over this pandemic time. And I'm mindful of those who don't have access to online stuff. And so where online church has been a barrier in itself, people aren't able to join in, they're not able to worship live. They may have turned into watchers rather than worshippers, or have that sense of watching what other people are doing at a separate time and in a separate place. And I think that's maybe something we could come back to. But there was also there's a sudden pressure of having lived at home and having got used to this balance of kind of online life and real kind of physical life for many years. As we entered the lockdown and everything became online, it was as though online space had been colonized suddenly by those who aren't normally online, but who would normally do things primarily in a physical gathering and in physical worship and physical communication. So people who would generally have phone calls suddenly started having Zoom meetings or video meetings, and people who would generally have physical meetings were suddenly having Zoom meetings. And in a sense, there was a pressure to attend because it was there and because everybody knew that everybody was at home, because there was nowhere else to be. And so the fact that my church started webcasting every morning prayer, and then Compline and lunchtime Eucharist, I had this sense that I had to be at all the services because I could be. And I think it took me a good 2 weeks of getting very tired because I'm not used to living that sort of rhythm of having things happening 7 days a week and being always on. It took me a good 2 weeks to make the distinction and realize that my church has always had services in the morning and at lunchtime and in the evening. And I've never before felt I had to be at all of them. But somehow when they're online, there is a pressure to turn up. Or certainly there was in those early days. And I think as well as the pressure to turn up, there can be a fear of missing out if you're not there on time and at the same time as other people. And that's perhaps been made even more intense in this time as we move to physical gathering for some people, continuing online worship for other people, and for many a kind of a hybrid worship or a continuation of being still in lockdown, still shielding, and uncertain of when, if ever, we'll be able to gather again and, for example, receive communion together.
And I think one of my fears in that is that for some churches, they're sort of starting to put a camera in the building on what's happening. And my fear in some of that is that the people in the building become the primary worshippers, and that somehow the people that, for whatever reason, can't be in the building can become almost like a second-class sort of worshipper. And I don't think that's the intention of people leading worship in those spaces. But for me, I feel I've been in the shielding category, so I guess I liken it to when the world started opening up and people were going into each other's gardens. And for me, having a few sort of WhatsApp conversations with a whole group that were gathered in a garden, and I was the only one on the end of a phone. And actually, I felt more isolated rather than less in that, because for me, it's like being painfully aware of something physically happening. I guess, and it is almost like the fear of missing out, but it's not quite, it's almost it's not fear of it. It's like, I actually know that I'm not connected in the same way with those people. And I think I'm nervous of what might happen in the church at the moment in the coming months. And it is hard because all of us are trying to balance physical buildings and online and what we do. I think I'm nervous that those of us who perhaps find it harder anyway in some of the physical spaces, how much effort are people continue to take to make it possible for us to be part of church? Or at what point does it become, sometimes I think accessibility, work around disability, around neurodiversity becomes sort of a nice to have an extra, but actually when it gets a bit difficult and money's difficult, time's difficult at the moment, actually do we become a step too far and actually lose our place and our voice within this? I don't know. I might be over fearful here, but my sense is some of that. Fiona, yeah.
I share that concern. I think one way forward is to be intentional about what we're doing, and within a service of people who are gathered, to create an intentional space for participation of those who are not physically present, but who may be worshipping online. I think it's very important to understand what it is we're doing when we're worshipping. Who is worshipping? Where is God? Are we in any sense saying that God is only in the building? God is only among those who are physically present, and that those who are not physically present are merely watchers? Or are we saying we are all worshipping? Because otherwise, where do you draw the line? Do you say that within a communion service, only the priest is worshipping, and those who are not the priest breaking the bread, they are the watchers, they are the recipients? Or are we all worshipping God with the language that we know and in the style which we're used to, and using the sacraments which are at the heart of our faith? I think at the same time that as well as there being the challenges and the issues and the restrictions of worship in these pandemic times, there's also been the openings up, those things which have been broken open as the churches have needed to close down. I know that in my own church, we now routinely have 1,500 people attending morning prayer online. That's simply a priest and maybe a couple of priests in a building saying morning prayer together. And there are 1,500 people watching each morning service, either joining live, several hundred joining live, or people worshipping at other times. Within these times, many people are being attracted to faith or are finding faith in ways they haven't before, either because of not being able to be physically present, or because of not wanting to turn up and not know how things work, or saying or doing the wrong thing in a church building. People have had questions and have wanted to explore, but haven't necessarily had the capacity. I think many people are finding faith and finding worship that works for them by being able to live stream a Saturday service from Teze, or to join a morning prayer from a cathedral, or to find that very simple complin from a convent. And those are ways in which we are being fed as Christians and as faith explorers, many for the first time.
What seems to be happening at the moment with the focus on buildings is that the worshippers coming into the building have started to become the sort of primary place of worship. And although there might be cameras and hybrid worship that people can join in from home, we're in danger that the default primary place becomes those people that are in the building. And are we in danger of making second-class citizens of those at home who are joining in different ways for whatever reason? And are we starting to overemphasize the gifts or the experience that those in the building bring? I'm sure Fiona's got something to add.
I think that reminds me of several points. Firstly, disabled people tend to be looked at as needy. There is a sense that, as we were saying earlier, there's a sense that disabled people are there to be ministered to and looked after and have things done for and spoken about. Generally within the church, we have things about disability. We don't have things of disabled people. But actually, disabled people are as much a combination of needs and gifts as everybody else. Our needs can be more obvious and our gifts may be less clear. As with anybody, I think in church we tend to say church is for the strong, and it's difficult for people within the church community to be open about vulnerability, to express weakness. We have this idea that all leaders must be strong. We have this very kind of muscular Christianity version of leadership, whereas actually Jesus was vulnerable. Jesus was broken and shared. And as Don Odidi, the Methodist minister Don Odidi, talks about, you have to be broken in order to be shared. He talks about his world was cracked open and life broke through. And there's that sense in which we need to be cracked open for life to break through. And maybe there's something about the pandemic which is a cracking open for the church, where we're being broken open and shared more widely through the diversity of ministry online, through the diversity of worship for those who are physically gathered and among those who are also gathered online. There is a sense in which we often talk about us rather than some of us. One of the positives of pandemic ministry is that suddenly people have been able to join in and participate from all sorts of places. And I know several churches who suddenly have a ministry among people who are at home with chronic illness and ME. And we can now move beyond those barriers of being physically present in order to participate, of being physically present in order to minister to each other, and actually be able to join in no matter where we are. Perhaps there's something about not being gathered in this parish model, not needing to be physically present in a building that may not be accessible in all sorts of ways, or in a time that doesn't work, but actually we uncover those gifts from all sorts of people who traditionally would not have had an opportunity to take part or to be known. And who knows what types of ministry that may bring in the future.
And I think that's one of the things I'm most excited about, that actually when we stop just trying to look for the gifts in the centre and recognise that everybody, those in the centre and those all over the place, have actually got that mix of gifts and needs. And actually, are we going to be open to seeing, nurturing, encouraging the gifts wherever they come and wherever they're starting to flourish? And it feels a bit more like gardening, that's a bit more organic and a bit more, well, actually, yeah, how do we actually let that mix of people and gifts actually develop and flourish, and see actually how the Spirit might blow through that?
A few years ago, we had a conference called Living on the Edge, and we'd been told, we've done disability now, we've done a conference, there's lots happening in the UK, we don't need to do anything more. And one of the people who was there said, well, I've been to these various places and I can see these different people are doing these things. And we said, but this is just the beginning. And so we put on a conference of inviting people from across the country doing all sorts of different types of work to come and simply share. And we said that it was something around how are disabled people responding when we find ourselves excluded. It's about how can we respond creatively to those things which are barriers. And it's not about waiting to be included. It's about living where we are, actually beginning to respond creatively in ministry, in our lives, where we are with what we have. We use the image of a forest and a path on the edge of a forest because the edge of a forest is a very particular place. It's not the centre and not the outside world. It's actually this very particular place. So things that would struggle to flourish in the middle will find light and space and room on the edge. And things on the edge which would be in danger find refuge and belonging on the edge of a forest. And so it becomes this very particular place. But by living on the edge, these things then change the nature of the forest itself because they make it bigger. And by making it bigger, they change where the centre is. And so by being called to live and minister exactly where we are, not waiting to be in the centre, in a place which can be very crowded and dark and difficult, and where you can only grow in a particular shape if you're going to stay there and kind of keep reaching up for the light. But actually, if you live on the edge, then you have a chance to grow and minister and become these differently shaped, differently thinking, differently wondering people that we've talked about being made to be. One of the gifts of this time is being able to have conversations with new people and be able to share ideas in new ways. So for the last 9 years, we've been hosting these conferences for rather than about disabled people. And that's been disabled people speaking to each other. And that's been a really precious time to have these conversations, and so we can empower and resource each other. But a couple of weeks ago, I was part of a panel with Heart Edge, and we shared some of these ideas with a gathered group of ministers and priests and people from other churches. And they were really interested to explore ideas in new ways. Rachel and I are part of a series of conversations with Heart Edge in the autumn, which is called Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up. And it's kind of disability in church, but it's disabled people talking to each other and sharing ideas within the context of a workshop, which is for non-disabled people or whoever wants to go. Because the panel that I did with Heart Edge last month had like 2,000 views, because people, I know it's ridiculous, people are interested in the others because they're new to them. I think it's very easy to take what we know for granted.
I'm learning, as I understand myself better, that I actually have to articulate what just seems the bleedingly obvious to me.
Exactly.
Is actually not for others, because people's experiences are so different. So I would notice much more around things like noise not working in a building. Yeah, like an aeroplane or whatever, like somebody munching or crunching is like I would note. So, for example, before the disability conference last year, when we were in a building, the access instructor was like, "Oh, fantastic! I know which toilets to avoid because they've got the really, really noisy dryers, and I can't cope with that." It's like, or I know that that's what I'm going to encounter when I go in that space.
Yeah.
It just, for people that don't have issues, it doesn't trigger challenges for them. You're just oblivious to it, I suspect. I don't know. And I think for me, it's that learning to actually not just experience it, but to articulate what my experience is and others, gives permission actually for other people to say what matters to be, and to learn from each other. Therefore, because the only way you can, I think there's a bit of a myth around accessible, like we said earlier about lifts, loose, ramps, and it's like there are so many different ways in which stuff connects and doesn't connect for people, and some stuff makes it just impossible to be in a space.
People say this is fully accessible, and I'm always like, what on earth does that mean? Because accessibility is an individual experience. It's not an organizational strapline. It's also seen as being a tick box. It's like a one-off. We have the lift through the loop, we have step-free access, and therefore we're fully accessible. But actually, if you come with particular needs, you don't know what that means. It's like, who are you saying it is accessible for? Like, some consultant has come and said you're now accessible. Well, what were they thinking, and what was their experience? What was the lens through which they were seeing? Often it's not about what we know. It's not about kind of already understanding lots of stuff. It's actually about the lens through which we see, isn't it? And so for me, going to something, I know that what I would need to understand is about public transport access or the building when you get there, and particularly what things look like is really helpful in understanding things, what things sound like, what things feel like, how hot is it going to be, how much is there going to be an echo, what sort of lights are there. But it's not about the building being perfect, and it's not about the environment being perfect. It's about understanding what sort of energy is it going to take to flourish in that environment, or what sort of energy is it going to take to bear being in that environment. How long can I stay for? How much of the day will I be able to endure? How much of the day will I be at my best? And what will the cost be? And in order to eke out my capacity on that day in a difficult space, how can I maximize the cost? And those are the qualitative conversations that disabled and neurodivergent people have to have with themselves in this micro planning all the time. And that's why, in a sense, we are bloody brilliant problem solvers, because we live in a constantly problem solving world. It's not about something being accessible. It's about how do we interact with it, and can we come and be in that space? Because what is disabling is often it's not the stairs, it's more often going to be not having the information, people not understanding, and the attitudes. If people come and they say it's about you and you are the problem, then actually that then creates the problem. Whereas if they say this is what we have, how can we make it work for you? Then you're given permission, and it becomes invitation, and it becomes participation, and it becomes about working together to make things better. See, for me, that's one of the joys of the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin's, which I haven't even talked about. We came from this space of being people who struggled to get in and join in. And over a long period, this is like year 9 of the work and year 5 or 6 of the Disability Advisory Group, we've gone through various iterations of a public meeting where people stated what their issues were, to a task group who would try and problem solve, but struggled with communication and creating effective change, into our iteration now, which is as open meetings once a term of people with interest and insight into physical, sensory, mental health, cognitive difficulties, mental health issues, neurodiversity. And we come together once a term in these open meetings to explore both issues and ideas, because those who experience the issues, those who are tripped up by the barriers, are the ones who are going to be more likely to say what works better. And that's why my starting point for always these things is what's working well, what's not working well, what else could we do? And so in a sense, we have become this amazing focus group embedded at St Martin's, where we can look at the work and the life and the ministry of the church and say, these things are working, these things aren't working, and would work better if we were able to do it this way. And here are other things we could do. And from the heart of that gathering together has come a kind of a ministry of the group in itself, where we now not only look at the practical things, but we also work together to explore various ideas and feed those into the conference. So we might explore, for example, the understanding of needs and gifts. Everybody is a combination of needs and gifts, but not everybody will approach it in that way. And so when you have a congregational exercise that invites everybody from the age of 2 to the age of 92 to join in and say, I need and I bring, when their favorite color pens around some sort of picture, I need and I bring. And then everyone says, I need this and I bring that. And very often there's a relationship between what people need and what people bring, because we will often find that in the depth of that need, we create an understanding of what would make the world a better place. And within that woundedness, there becomes a very deep healing. And then we offer that healing to others, because I think particularly as neurodivergent people, we don't want other people to suffer in the way that we have suffered. When we see something, we experience something, we are broken by something, we want to say, what can I bring to make it better? Which is a ministry in itself.
It is, because we want to reduce other people being silenced, reduce other people feeling excluded, unheard. And you have to get quite brave in the first place to be able to articulate it when your voice is counter to what's going on. And that's for me, the exciting bit of the Disability Advisory Group model and the conference, because it's like actually it's sort of a combined courage of recognising that you're not alone, you're not isolated. Other people are doing this. So people that have kind of survived it, found a way to be in church with this, do something when they actually open that up and make it more possible for others to acknowledge their individuality, the things they come with, and how we can all be part of this together somehow.
I think there's something about building a critical mass, isn't there? When you come together, it's not necessarily about creating a big change, but it's actually about empowering each other and strengthening each other, because nothing says belonging like not feeling you're on your own.
Yes.
And nothing says empowerment like me too.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the core things of the conference is that we don't talk about what it is to have Tourette's or what it is to be autistic or what it is to have ADHD. We simply arrive and invite and are neurodivergent people. And then we talk about our experience. So that might be to tell a story of experience to frame the day, to say, I am neurodivergent and this has been my experience within the church. And that then frames the wider conversation, which might be, for example, exploring neurodivergent models within the Bible and a neurodivergent hermeneutic. of the Bible, or it may be understanding the social justice imperative of neurodivergent people. And why are we created to want to change the world and make things better? And what does it mean to be somebody who's an amazing proofreader or can only hear things in music? And it's be able to start those conversations which are not about the needs, but they're actually about the gifts. They are about finding those parallels and finding the ways in which we minister to each other and we minister to the church, often in ways which are unseen, but we're often labelled. And because we're labelled as being broken or different or deficient in some way, then those ministries, those gifts can be overlooked. And it's as though because you don't minister in this particular way, your ministry is not valid. And the whole invalid or invalid model, the disabled, the broken, the deficit.
Yeah, you want to celebrate the joys of the life and the flourishing and actually the amazing contributions that people offer. Yeah.
I think that actually that's a very good note to draw our conversations to a close. Thank you for a wonderful conversation, Fiona and Rachel. Really appreciated your time, and we look forward to talking to you again, I hope, in the future. All the very best to you both as you face the new world that we're in, and all the best with those conversations that will be coming up, which we'll be advertising on our website. So thank you both.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. You can engage with our work through following us on Twitter and Facebook, and at our website, susannawesleyfoundation.org. We would love to hear from you.